It was really wonderful to hear everything that Steve said. And I cannot explain to you how amazing my time in Siberia has been. And I would like to thank all of you from the beginning for giving me this opportunity. This was actually my dream come true. And as Steve mentioned, I could not picture a more perfect fit than the ICWA Fellowship for what I wanted to do in Siberia. So when I found ICWA, I decided to take the Institute at their word. And when I read the mission, I thought, do they really want to find out what I want to research for 2 years? And I remember going home and talking to my roommate about it, and she said, I think you should just be honest. You should just write exactly what you think. And I remember writing that letter in one breath. I think I'm not sure if I even edited it, and I remember sending it to Steve and receiving an email from him the next day saying that they're interested and they want to hear more. And this is how my journey with the Institute has started. And now, going into my prepared speech, in December 2007, as I was, after my last interview with the ICWA trustees, I was actually in Arlington, Virginia, staying with one of my best friends from my Wall Street days. And as I anxiously awaited Steve's phone call to let me know whether I was going to be an ICWA fellow or not, I tried to relax by watching TV. My friend's husband was flipping through the channels and he stopped at a National Geographic program. And as the camera swooped across the panorama of snowy pine forests, he asked, "Is that Canada?" And even though I had no way of knowing for sure, I said, "No, that's Siberia." It turned out I was right. And I took that as a good sign. 10 minutes later, Steve called to let me know that I really was going to spend 2 years living in Siberia. What do you think when you hear Siberia? Most people think of frozen, cold plains, gulags, men in big fur hats. A lot of that is true. But there's also much, much more to Siberia. This vast land is 2/3 of Russia. It has some of the world's most pristine ecosystems, from magnificent boreal forests to fragile Arctic tundra. Siberia is also a land full of oil, gas, diamonds and gold, fish and timber. For most of the year, it's a land with a harsh and forbidding climate, with average winter temperatures between -15 and -50 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes dropping as low as -90. For someone with bad circulation like me, that was a little bit of a problem. However, in the summer, it actually goes up to 100 degrees. In the coldest regions of Siberia, permafrost, the soil that stays frozen for all of the year, can reach as far down as 5 miles. The people who live in this land of extremes are known for their physical strength and stamina. Many proudly call themselves Siberians before they would say they're Russian. And even today, many Siberian city dwellers still hunt and fish. Misha, one of my close friends from Baikal, teaches computer science at a big university in Ulan-Ude, one of the big cities near Baikal. But he still goes home to his village to hunt duck, quail, and sometimes even bears. As he explained it to me, Siberians do it not only to supplement their often meager salaries, but also because, just like their fathers and grand-grandfathers, they love being alone with the wilderness. Russians colonized Siberia in the 17th century in their quest for fur. And since then, the Tsars, the Soviets, and now the new Russian elite have made enormous profits from Siberia's riches. It's Siberian oil and gas that has made Russia the new powerful economic and political entity. But industrial development of Siberia has left it with a heavy legacy. Russia's most polluted cities and contaminated lands are here, often right next to untouched wilderness. Why should we care about this land? There are many reasons, from its vast forests that provide the world not only with timber but also with oxygen, to its permafrost fields that could release millions of tons of methane into the atmosphere if they melt. But one of the main reasons why we should care about Siberia is its water. At the southern border of Siberia lies Lake Baikal, the world's deepest, oldest, purest lake. Baikal contains 20% of the world's fresh water. And for those who have been following my newsletters, you probably remember all the superlatives. It's more than 25 million years old. Because of the age and isolation of this lake, it has developed a unique flora and fauna. Species exist there that exist nowhere else on Earth. Some of them, like millions of tiny shrimp called Epishura, miraculously filter the upper 160 feet of Baikal 3 times a year. The lake is also a place of breathtaking beauty, as Steve and Rose can attest. It's over a mile deep and more than almost 400 miles long, the distance from LA to Sacramento. This crystal blue lake, shaped like a crescent, is surrounded by snowy peaks that rise more than 7,000 feet into the air. Humans have been fascinated by the lake and have worshipped it for thousands of years. One legend tells that Genghis Khan was so taken by the beauty of Baikal that he declared it to be a forbidden zone, one where no human development was allowed. People who live on Baikal revere it so much that they don't call it a lake. They call it the sacred sea. The lake is a cultural symbol of purity and untouched wilderness. Every Russian knows of Baikal, and many dream of visiting it at least once in their lifetime. As a child growing up in the Soviet Union, reading books about the wild Siberia, so did I. The summer I left my Wall Street law firm job, I spent 2 weeks in this rough, beautiful land, sleeping in a tent and cooking meals over a fire. I was spending my vacation volunteering for a local NGO called the Great Baikal Trail, helping them build hiking trails around the lake. Just as many before me, I too fell for Baikal. But I was also amazed and inspired by the people I met that summer. People who dedicate their lives to protecting this magnificent place, working for extremely small salaries and often putting their lives in grave danger. Since then, I began to work with them and help them in their efforts to create a sustainable future for this region. But I knew that if I wanted to continue my work in Siberia, I needed to learn about this land from the inside. I went to Baikal on my Eco Fellowship to figure out who makes decisions that affect this lake and people who live near it. Whose interests are taken into consideration and why, and what possible levers of influence locals have in this process. Remarkably, Baikal remains one of the purest lakes on Earth. Despite the Soviet Union history of poisoning its land, Baikal's water is still very close to its pristine primordial state. It's so free of impurities that it's close to distilled. It's the only open body of water on Earth where water is of such high quality that it can be bottled for human consumption. In a world where a billion people don't have access to clean drinking water, this lake is a world treasure. And it was recognized as such by UNESCO in 1996 when it declared Baikal to be a World Heritage Site. But despite its precious water, the sacred sea is under increasing strain of industrial development. There are hotspots of pollution around the lake, from a notorious pulp mill located directly on the shore, to unregulated sewage from settlements around Baikal and toxic air emissions from heavy industry nearby. The lake's immense size and its legendary ability of self-purification have created a myth of invincibility. The Russian government and companies argue that Baikal can withstand more pollution. But much about how Baikal's unique ecosystem functions remains unknown, and we have no idea where the tipping point lies beyond which pollution will be too much for this lake to bear. The Russian government often makes grand pronouncements about Lake Baikal and its importance to the country. But as I've discovered in Siberia, it's mainly through the efforts of dedicated individuals, small NGOs and their international partners, and people taking to the streets in protest that the lake has survived in its pristine state so far. Whether it will remain so in the decades to come is an open question. I'd like to talk a little more in detail about the pulp mill at the southern shore of Baikal, because I believe it's a striking example of absurd decision-making and government ineptitude when it comes to managing this amazing resource. Even the New York Times has published a series of articles about this mill because it's one of the main polluters of Baikal. It's the only industrial factory that discharges waste directly into the world's largest reservoir of clean water. The Soviets decided to build the mill in the 60s to produce supercord, a mysterious material used in military plane tires. So in a way, Baikal, with its clean water and abundant supply of timber, became a victim of the Cold War. But even in that time, when political dissent of any kind was simply unthinkable, people were so shocked by the government's decision that prominent scientists and writers openly spoke against it. And this is how the Russian environmental movement was born. But the mill was built nonetheless. The mill violated existing water treatment laws from the beginning. Soon after, the supercord became obsolete, having been replaced by plastics. But the mill was built, a whole town grew up around it to service the factory, and it went on to produce much more mundane products, cellulose for paper and cardboard. Since the mill uses chlorine, it also discharges thousands of tons of toxic substances into Baikal on a daily basis, from sulfur oxides to chlorinated organics, suspended particles, nitrates, phosphates, phenols, sulfates, dioxins, and heavy metals. Even more chemicals seep into the groundwater, and 6 million tons of liquid waste are stored in open-air pits near the shore of Baikal in a highly seismic zone. The local EPA warns that in the event of an earthquake, thousands of tons of this waste could go into Baikal in seconds, resulting in an environmental catastrophe. The head of the mill's environmental safety department told me that the mill presents no risk to humans and minimal risk to the environment. The mill and its supporters say that its toxins disperse through the immense lake, diluting to harmless concentrations. But there's a 20-mile dead zone where the mill's discharge pipe sticks into Baikal, and the lake's keystone species, the little Epishura shrimp, can't survive there. This means that all the other species up the food chain don't live there either. Scientists still debate what concentrations of chemicals are harmful to this ecosystem. Baikal has many mysteries. Its currents are one of them. It may be that the toxins are not dispersing evenly. Sometimes some scientists believe that pollutants, as well as plankton, distribute against horizontal lines of currents. This means that the fish that come there to feed get hit with a concentrated dose of toxins. The mill's toxic air emissions have killed swaths of ancient pine forests on nearby mountain ranges, and may be the reason for higher cancer, asthma, and other diseases in the people who live near the mill. Marina Rikhvanova was one of the women who runs Baikal Wave, a local NGO that's been central in its fight against the mill. She told me, "I started out as a biologist, studying the effects of the mill on the lake. After a while, as I learned more about it, I couldn't just study it. I had to do something about it." Recently, Marina received the prestigious Goldman Prize, an award for environmental activists who do outstanding work. The prize comes with $100,000. She spent more than half of that money on grants to the people who live in Baikalsk, the pulp mill town. The grants were for small business initiatives to create new jobs in tourism and agriculture. Not many people know this. From my experience, Many more accuse her and Geo of trying to take away people's livelihoods by shutting down the mill. The Russian government has been trying to make the mill more benign for decades, issuing numerous decrees, calling for an end of toxic discharges into Baikal, creating commissions on Baikal issues, even adopting a special law on protection of Lake Baikal. The law prohibits most types of industrial activities on the lake, including production of pulp without a closed water cycle. All to no avail. The mill continued to dump chlorinated waste into the lake. When Putin was president, he personally asked the World Bank for a loan to modernize the mill and switch it to closed-loop technology. After the World Bank promised $22 million, one of Kremlin's favorite oligarchs, Oleg Deripaska, bought a majority stake in the mill. Shortly thereafter, the World Bank withdrew from the project, stating that the Russian side failed to live up to its obligations under the contract. The mill's new owners said that they would build the closed loop cycle themselves. More time passed. In 2007, the Russian EPA finally sued the mill for illegal discharges into Baikal. It's actually not clear why it took them so long to take action. As I mentioned earlier, the mill has been violating Russian laws since the day it opened in 1966, more than 40 years ago. Perhaps it had something to do with an earlier decision by President Putin to divert an oil pipeline from the north shore of Baikal. After thousands of people took to the streets with banners that said, "Baikal is worth more than oil," Putin went on TV to declare the lake a national treasure and said, "If there is even the smallest, tiniest chance of polluting Baikal, then we must think of future generations. We must do everything to make sure that this danger is not just minimized, but eliminated." Perhaps taking his cue, 2 years later, the Russian Minister of Natural Resources gave the pulp mill a stern warning, saying not one drop of waste products should go into Baikal. By the end of that summer, the mill's owners claimed that they had finally built the closed water system. The ministry even came to an opening ceremony to cut the ribbon and said, "Protection of Lake Baikal justifies any expense." But as the mill's workers told me, the system was a sham from the beginning. They said, "The pipes constantly clogged up and we had to stop the entire production cycle to push pulp out." This is from one of the engineers who had been working for years on creating this system. A lot of the mill's workers refused to talk to the press, but this man, he told me in a private conversation, "We just couldn't get it to work." And in fact, just a month after the minister's visit, the mill abruptly stopped. They claimed that lack of demand for unbleached cellulose made the mill unprofitable, and asked the government to allow them to reopen the cycle to resume making bleached cellulose, which meant dumping waste directly into Baikal again. Otherwise, they said the mill would go bankrupt. They would have to lay off all of their workers, and there would be horrible social unrest in the town of Baikalsk. The government called this blackmail. It looked like the mill's days were numbered. Everyone, including the local administration, agreed that an old, dilapidated factory did not belong here. The mill began to fire its employees and initiated bankruptcy procedures. I remember that that entire winter was a very difficult time for the people of Baikalsk. I went there on a regular basis. The mill failed to pay people their salaries and unemployment benefits for months. Young men loitered on street corners. Mothers would tell me, I worry about letting my kid walk down the street with a cell phone because they get mugged so often now." Everyone who had a car turned into a taxi driver. Even though the mill only employed 2,000 people out of the 14,000 who lived in town, its shutdown had a domino-like effect on everyone. Most of Russia's urban population lives in monotowns, cities that depend on a single factory. And as the financial crisis spread through the country, shutting those plants down, these people found themselves on the street with very few options. Some workers from the mill, especially good specialists, managed to find jobs elsewhere. A woman from the mill's trade union told me, the young ones, they simply took off and left. But now we have all these kids growing up without fathers. Most of those who stayed looked to the government to solve their problems. They said it was the state that brought us here to build this mill in this town. It's the state that should help us now. Instead, they just talk and talk and talk. Several women staged hunger strikes in front of the local administration. Stores in the town displayed signs that read, "We don't sell food on credit." Some people survived by renting their apartments to tourists. There's a popular ski resort near the mill, and many skiers from nearby cities come there in winter. Local administration and NGOs like Marina's Baikal Wave work on creating new jobs for the people of the town. By spring, tension eased and the worst seemed behind. The government prepared a federal program to develop tourism in this area, to create more jobs for the entire southern region of Baikal. But then, in June 2009, Prime Minister Putin came to Baikal. In one of his macho feats that Russian TV shows so often now, he took a dive to the bottom of the world's deepest lake in a mini submarine. 4 hours later, when he came back, Putin declared that Baikal is in a good condition and hinted that the mill might be reopened. This came as a complete surprise to most people. The next day, Putin met with local scientists and asked them how the mill has harmed Baikal in the 43 years of its operation. Not one of them stood up. In one of the many ironic twists of the story, this incident took place at a conference on environmental protection. Perhaps, as an acquaintance of mine said to me, these scientists were afraid to speak because they're afraid for their jobs and they're afraid to lose their research funding. Later, however, as the news got out, other scientists wrote public letters to the government detailing many of the damaging effects of the mill on Baikal's ecosystem. But just like in the 1960s, this didn't make a difference. The federal program for development of tourism on Baikal's southern shore was put on hold. The same officials who earlier said that the mill must be closed began to say that they must find compromises between protecting the lake and providing people with jobs. The mill started to rehire some workers, but only for short-term contracts. The question that my friends in Irkutsk were asking was, why? Why reopen a bankrupt, dilapidated enterprise that has been polluting the world's cleanest lake for decades? Why give money to an old pulp mill that, at least according to its own books, doesn't make a profit anymore? Why create more pulp and toxic waste instead of creating new, stable jobs in the region? Ever since Putin's pal, Deripaska, acquired the mill, his managers cut costs by cutting spending on repair, maintenance, safety, and social expenditures for the workers. Even the people who want to keep their jobs complain about the unsafe conditions at the mill. At a conference organized by local NGOs, I was really surprised to hear one worker who was brought there by the company to express his support for the mill finish his speech by saying, "If you could see where we work, you would be terrified." And he described rotten stairs, equipment so worn out that it's now dangerous, and lack of basic safety gear. Some other workers have leaked photographs of the mill to a local news site. The photos show buildings in complete disrepair, rusting pipes, cracks in the walls, and weeds growing all over the territory. But since the mill is now a private enterprise, the public and the press are not allowed in it without explicit permission from the owners. For example, no independent experts have been admitted to inspect the mill after a big earthquake in 2008, the epicenter of which was only 20 miles away. The mill still hasn't been able to resume full production, but this summer, 2 workers died in it, they suffocated in one of the plant's buildings trying to get the mill up and running. The management is not signing long-term contracts with the workers. It has changed 8 directors in the past 2 years and hasn't been able to find a head engineer for months. The mill has used up all the timber nearby, and bringing wood from other regions makes production economically unfeasible. Not many people believe that the mill will actually be working. So again, why reopen it? One of the worst twists in the story took place this past January. Putin issued a decree that single-handedly changed the law on Baikal. He simply took out the paragraph prohibiting production of cellulose and use of chlorine on the shores of the lake. The obvious effect of this is to make the mill's operations legal again. But he also took out a ban on storing and burning of waste on Baikal. This might benefit the mill's owners, who right now will be liable for 6 million tons of waste stored in open pits near Baikal. It's expensive to take it somewhere else, and burning it right there, despite the resulting pollution, would be a much cheaper option. There are many financial interests involved, from the owners who receive loans to reopen the mill, to the mill's creditors, who would get only cents on the dollar if the mill really did become bankrupt. But the bigger question is whether Putin's decree is the beginning of something much more significant. Something that could become a much bigger threat to Baikal than one pulp mill. Is it possible that Putin and the federal government, with their talk of compromises, are preparing ground for opening up Baikal to more industrial development? One of the problems with the decision-making process in Russia is that it's completely non-transparent. It's also completely unpredictable, as I hope the story illustrates. Baikal and the land around it have many natural resources. Russia's biggest zinc mine lies at the northern shore of the lake. The company that bought the license hasn't been able to start mining operations since the law on Baikal banned all industrial activities near the lake. This company has been lobbying local governments in Kremlin for an exception. And until now, the federal government has refused its advances. By the way, it's the same company that supplied the mini submarines for Putin's dive into the lake. The government of Buryatia, the region on the east side of Baikal, is already on their side. The president of Buryatia, himself a Putin appointee, likes to say, "We're hostages of this lake." He means that the region would be much better off economically were it not for all the prohibitions protecting Baikal. There's gas in the lake itself, and recently Buryatia offered the state gas monopoly giant Gazprom to put a gas pipeline at the bottom of Baikal. So it was fearing this vision of the lake as an industrial playground that local NGOs began to organize against Putin's decree. This February, in the dead of Siberian winter, people again took to the streets of Irkutsk, the city where I was living, carrying signs that said, "Our bodies are 70% Baikal water," and calling upon the mill's owner, Deripaska, to clean up after himself. As an aside, when Deripaska's PR firm got wind of some signs with his name on them that were about to be taken to the demonstration, they actually called the NGO with whom I was interviewing at the time and asked them to not mention Deripaska's name during the demonstration. That didn't work. The government's reaction was also very swift. FSB and officers from the Center for Fighting Extremism, an entity that used to fight organized crime and now seems to fight social activists, showed up at Baikal Wave's offices. They came to confiscate the group's computers on the pretense of the NGO using illegal computer software. This is in a country where more than 80% of all computer software is illegal. Even though the NGO actually had all proper documents, the police refused to look at those. They actually said, "We're not specialists in that." 6 months later, they returned the computers to Baikal Wave. They didn't find any illegal software, by the way. Sure, it hampered the group's work, but they still managed to organize some protest campaigns. During the protest in February, we were surprised to discover armored vehicles with AK-47s, famous Russian machine guns, strapped to their roofs, and armed men in black face masks standing around the corner from where we were gathering. It was such an unnecessary show of force. There were many small kids and old people in the demonstration, and one father wondered, would they really shoot at my 6-year-old? And this is one of the main questions that I was trying to answer during my time in Siberia. Does the Russian government really fear opposition or its own people? Or does it see the two as identical? I was also surprised to learn that some things were actually better in the 1980s, when TV reporters defied their bosses to film anti-government protests around Baikal and fought to show this footage on main TV channels. This February, official TV did not report the demonstrations, and several news programs actually showed footage from the anti-mill protest, describing it as a gathering of pro-mill workers who were showing their support for Putin's decision. But maybe not all is lost yet. Siberia is the land of many riches, but one of its greatest resources is its people. People who come together to protect places like Lake Baikal. This remarkable lake inspired a remarkable social phenomenon, a loose association of people from all walks of life who call themselves the Baikal Movement. These people who wouldn't necessarily meet or interact with each other in regular life, who disagree strongly on political and social issues, put aside their beliefs and personal ambitions for one goal: protecting Baikal. They're physicists, journalists, businessmen, scientists, computer programmers, students, and retirees. Some of them work on Baikal issues all the time, others join in when disaster strikes, when yet another pipeline or a change in law threatens the lake. They don't have official leaders, an official membership structure, or closed meetings. Like Baikal itself, the movement's fluid, ever-changing nature makes it difficult to study and much more difficult to control. One of these incredibly dedicated people that I had the privilege of meeting is Gala. She's a petite blonde woman in her late 30s who gave up her career in international relations to run a small hotel on Baikal after she became active in the movement. She told me, even people who call themselves the Baikal Movement can't give an equivocal definition of what it is. But after talking to many of these people, I noticed that the one thing that unites them is a very simple, very powerful emotion. They all believe that Baikal is sacred. So for them, protecting this lake is not a matter of civic duty, not a question of patriotism that thinks of Baikal as a strategic resource because of the enormous amount of water in it. It's a question of their relationship with the world around them, their highest, most important values. And in Baikal's pure waters, they actually do see a reflection of their conscience. It's possible that the mill is not going to kill the lake. Maybe you can really build a gas pipeline at the bottom of Baikal and mine zinc up north without destroying the lake's unique ecosystem. But this is not the approach that people in the Baikal movement take. One of the people I met is Vladimir, a 70-year-old geologist who spent his life researching mineral deposits around the lake, and after his retirement started an activist NGO. He told me, we don't put toilets in the middle of cathedrals. And we don't ask ourselves how many times it's okay to spit into a well. Is 3 times okay? Is 5? 5 might be okay. The well and the cathedral will be fine. It's a question of us. The movement to protect Baikal started as a natural expression of people's anger over government's failure to understand the spiritual significance of this lake. What I've discovered is that the situation remains the same today as it did 20 or 30 years ago under the Soviet Union. Just like in the 80s, the official media calls these people extremists. Just like in the 80s, police and local administrations do everything possible to prevent public demonstrations. Back in the USSR, these people's actions got labeled as unlawful, harmful, and anti-communist. Today they get accused of being foreign agents, or paid by the West to destroy Russia's economy. One of the main leaders of the Baikal Movement in the 1980s, a well-known ornithologist named Anatoly Sosunov, went from being a respected scientist with a steady job to working as a street cleaner. This happened because he believed that we have a responsibility to keep Baikal free from industrial development of any kind. The Soviet Union produced a whole generation of such street cleaners. Activists, scientists, musicians, and philosophers who didn't agree with the regime, who were kicked out of their jobs, or did not want to work for what they saw as a corrupt state. For them, heating coal or cleaning the streets was a way to comply with a law that required universal employment, but it was also a way to stay free. As I mentioned earlier, things have not changed, and in some respects have gotten harder for those who disagree with the state. You probably read in the news about journalists or lawyers getting killed in Russia. But in the words of Gala, the Baikal movement existed, exists, and will continue to exist. I believe she's right. It's impossible to destroy a natural expression of people's love for their land by confiscating their computers, harassing their relatives, or labeling them as foreign spies. Perhaps because of people like Gala and Marina and other people in the movement, the Russian government is again starting to talk about closing the mill. Different ministers are saying different things, sometimes within an hour of each other, about the immediate future of this plant. But by this point we know that until the mill is actually dismantled, those will remain nothing but empty words. The Russian environmental movement was born out of people's disagreement with the government over Baikal. And as I've come to believe during my 2 years in Russia, the way people feel about this lake, the sacred sea of Siberia, is really a reflection of their soul. And what makes me feel hopeful about the future of Siberia are the people that I met during the fellowship. The people who, when they look at Baikal, see divinity in its purest and most spectacular form. Last January, one of my close friends from the north shore of the lake, who was one of my roommates in Irkutsk, gave birth to a beautiful baby girl they named Maria. This August, I had the honor of becoming her godmother. During the baptism, the Russian Orthodox priest dipped Maria into the already cold waters of the lake 3 times, and I hope she will forgive us that or not remember it when she grows up. But on a more serious note, to my friends, no church or cathedral built by man can be more sacred than this lake, the lake where they were born and where they want to raise their children. And I think my goddaughter's baptism certificate says it perfectly, because under Church of Christening, it actually says Lake Baikal. And I can only hope that 20 years from now, she will see her reflection in the still purest, deepest lake in the world. I left Siberia this August, but I'm planning to continue my work there, to put everything that I learned during this fellowship to good use. And one of my projects in the making is to create a system of legal support for Siberian NGOs, because I know that they can certainly use some good lawyers. And with that, I again want to thank all of you and the Institute for making my dream come true. It would not be possible without you, and I could not imagine a more perfect opportunity to study what I needed to study, to continue my sometimes unpredictable path that, as Steve said, I know will be connected with Siberia and its environmental issues. And of course I want to thank Steve for all of his support and encouragement during these 2 years, for being the most wonderful boss ever, and for having so much faith in me from the beginning. I'd also like to thank Ellen for her beautiful work on my newsletters, for all the wonderful maps of Russia that she made, and for her patience. And I'd like to thank Mira for keeping track of my financials and for her enthusiastic responses to my photographs. I'd like to thank Mary Lynn for her passionate encouragement of my writing. And I'd also like to thank my parents for their boundless love and support for everything that I've done in my life, whether it was going to law school or being sent off to Siberia. Thank you all for believing in me.